Okay, we are back for part 2 of our chapter 3 lecture. And if you remember, we have already covered the content of an effective report. We have covered factual, accurate, objective, and complete. And we've also covered a couple of portions of the form of an effective report, or a well-written report, which would be concise and clear. And now we want to look at the portion that covers grammatically and mechanically correct. So the mechanics of spelling, capitalization, and punctuation involved in translating ideas and spoken words into written words, they're very, very important, because mistakes in spelling and punctuation and capitalization and even grammar can cause people to think of you a little bit differently, especially if you consider whether it's the judge or a jury. But I mean, let's ask the question: mistakes in spelling, punctuation, capitalization, and grammar do what? What do you think they do? Well, unfortunately, they might give the impression or perception, which I don't like that word, that the person writing the report is just careless, or maybe even uneducated. So consider that spelling is the most important part of writing. Even if the structure of your paragraph leaves a little to be desired, if you spell everything correctly, the reader might forgive you a little bit for the paragraphs being a little bit too long or a little bit too short, or even if you don't use paragraphs properly. But if your spelling is very bad, people just aren't going to cut you that much slack. There's not that much forgiveness, if you will, and they're going to look at you in a different light. So a good rule, or one of the rules to think about, is if you can't spell it, look it up, don't just guess, or maybe use a different word. So, but be careful with like abbreviating as well. So I'll give you kind of a really quick example. The word methamphetamine. Now, most people, or a lot of people, I shouldn't say that, would have a problem maybe spelling that if they've never, had the opportunity to spell it before. So, one thought would be, well, I know, I'll just use the word meth. Everybody knows what that means, and I'll just put that in there. Well, everybody doesn't know that's an abbreviation. So please don't just make up little abbreviations and things like that. Spell things out, but make sure you know how to spell it. So one of the rules to think about is if you can't spell it, use something else. Now, nowadays, of course, in current times, most officers, they either type their reports or they dictate them. And if you do dictate them, a lot of times you don't have to spell the words out because the typist will catch that for you. But again, you still have to review the report for accuracy. And for officers typing on computers, which a lot of agencies do, most have internet access and can find a program online to check their spelling. Some of the report writing programs that departments use, they actually have a spell check in there. Just use caution when relying on grammar and spell checker type programs to find mistakes, because a lot of times something that you initially see it on the screen, and then when you hit the space bar to move on to another word, it may change it to a different word, a closer word or similar. So just, you have to go back and look. So don't assume, I guess. And of course, everything really does need to be written in standard English. People often disagree also about what standard English might be. And so just standard basic English is really important, and they'll teach you a lot of that as you go through the academy and even in training. But again, this is just, think about the issues related to being grammatically and mechanically correct. And underneath this mechanically and grammatically correct area falls into making sure that you break your report up, or it follows these certain characteristics. So the first one that we're going to look at when we talk about standard English, etc., would be paragraphs. So here's kind of a list, and then we'll go through each one of these very, very quickly. So paragraphs: past tense, first person, active voice, audience focused, and making everything that you write legible, and of course turned in on time. Okay, so paragraphs. Here's my thought. Use them. Because if you write one humongous page of text and it's one big block, it's extremely difficult to read. So as we talked a little bit earlier, in structuring your narrative and making your report clear, effective writers use paragraphs to help guide the reader, and it's also going to help you. And keep the paragraphs relatively short, maybe around 100 to 125 words or something like that. And if you need to, skip a line to indicate the beginning of a new paragraph. And discuss only one subject in each of the paragraphs. Start a new paragraph when you change either speakers, locations, times, or ideas, if that kind of makes sense. And it's going to really make it a lot easier for the reader to follow. Past tense. Write in the past tense throughout your report. Past tense writing uses verbs that show that the events have already occurred. So you report, or your report, well, there's an error that we caught right there, contains what was true at the time that you wrote it. So hopefully that kind of makes sense as well. Now again, if your organization wants it different, you're going to follow that particular pathway and do what that organization requires. This typically is what most organizations have you do. First person. Use the first person to refer to yourself. This is I, me, my, we, us, and our. The sentence, I responded to the call, is writing in first person. This would contrast with this officer responded to the call, which uses the third person. And hopefully you can understand that. Now, whether you remember your English classes and discussions of first, second, and third person, singular and plural is kind of irrelevant in this particular instance. Simply remember to refer to yourself as I rather than this officer. Okay? Next would be active voice. A sentence may be either active or passive. And this is an easy distinction to make if you think about what the words active and passive actually mean. In the active voice, the subject of the sentence performs the actions. So that would be something like, I wrote the report. In the passive voice, in contrast, the passive voice would be something like, the report was written by me. So you can see hopefully the issues with that. Now again, very few, but some agencies may require you to write a different way. So you're going to have to adapt to that particular writing style. But for the most part, most agencies have you write, in the active voice. Next would be audience focused. Always consider who your audience is, and recall the diversity of readers of police reports that we talked about. And given these varied backgrounds and individuals with somewhat limited familiarity with law enforcement terminology, the necessity for audience-focused reports really does become obvious, and it's really important. Keeping in mind this diverse audience, you're going to need to construct remember we've said this a couple of times, a reader-friendly type report. And one way to be reader-friendly is to be certain that the narrative portion of your report can stand alone, and that calls for eliminating these phrases such as the above. So a reader-friendly report does not begin like this example I'm going to give you. On the above date and time, I responded to the above address to investigate a burglary in progress. So can you see the issues with that? Using these types of phrases present a couple of problems. First, if the reader takes the time to look above, to find the information, their train of thought is kind of broken. It's difficult to find where to resume reading, and the reader wastes a lot of time. And then second, if the reader does not take the time to look above, important information isn't conveyed. And it's very likely the reader, perhaps subconsciously, is going to wonder what would have been found above. So it causes confusion using the word above. So it's easier just to put in the information, the address, the date, and the time. Or your name, not the above officer. I, blah, blah, blah. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. And then legible and on time. And this is the last of the characteristics, if you will. So it does little good to learn to write well if no one can read it, or if the report is turned in after it was actually needed. Now, typically, if it's an in-custody type report, you're going to get 48 hours, and you're going to need to turn that in. Now, department policy might dictate something else. The issue of legibility refers to the ease to which a handwritten or even type-printed character is recognizable or recognized based on its appearance. Now, some people, their handwriting is atrocious, and it's so sloppy or scribbly that it's difficult, if not impossible, to discern individual letters. And here's the thing, don't feel bad, I'm guilty. When I was in elementary school, and even parts of high school, but more of elementary school, I remember being taught how to write in cursive. And you could only use a pencil until your writing was good enough, and then you would get a pen. And believe it or not, at that time, I got my pen, and I was actually pretty excited about that. And for a while, my handwriting, my cursive writing was okay. Now it is horrible. You can barely read it. So I am so glad for the advent of computers. But even then, you still need to be careful. So some people just have that sloppy writing. Now, similarly, some typeface or fonts are visually challenged, kind of challenging to read. So stay away from those. Ideally, reports should be typed in a very simple, common font like Times New Roman or something that the department allows. And there's a couple of different ones, but that's kind of one of the basic ones. Now, in today's computer-driven world, most reports are generated this way. We type them on the computer. And sometimes, however, this is not practical or possible. In fact, a poorly typed report is often as difficult to read as a kind of non-legible one. So if you do not type your reports and you know that you have poor handwriting, you may want to print your reports by hand. And I know that might take a long time printing, but I mean these are just some things that you have to kind of consider. So let's take a second and I'm going to read this to you. So here's something that came out of actually a cross-examination. Officer, would you read the marked section from your report? And here it is. I attempted to apply an escort hold to the subject, but I noted resistive tension in his arm, so I applied pain compliance instead. The subject actively resisted, so I administered a focused knee strike to the lower abdominal area and decentralized the subject. So here's the response back. In other words, officer, you tried to grab my client's arm, and when he pulled away, you twisted his wrist and then kicked him in the groin and threw him down on the pavement. Is that about it? Well, and then the officer, well, I wouldn't put it quite in those words. And then, of course, the comment back, no, officer, I imagine you wouldn't. No further questions. So can you see how the officer in this case is trying to use all these big words when actually the defense attorney summed it up? And I've seen officers say things like that. I then applied a distractive blow to the subject. What does that even mean? Because you're going to be asked, remember this, that what you write, if it's not clear and understandable, someone is going to ask you to tell them what that means. And that could be in front of a jury. So isn't it better just to write what you did initially instead of coming up with some cool buzzword or phrase and being questioned at the time, during a trial? So think about this little exercise as a learning lesson. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about recording or dictating reports, because this typically is in the current technology phase that we're in. There are different ways that law enforcement will have you do a report. Some of them, typically when you're in training, you might handwrite them, and then there'll be a time where you can either type them on a computer into a template and type your narrative into an open template, etc., or you can record them through the means of dictation, and some agencies still use that. So recording or dictating a report is very common in some departments. And the demand for transcription services and software is increasing across the country. And the reason for that, the fact that many departments are moving in this direction, is because that it is more efficient and less costly than the old-fashioned method of, let's say, tape recording. So a lot of times you might dictate your report and they send it to a transcription service, and that service will type it up and then they'll send it back and you need to review it. So, you know, at the end of the day, these are a couple of different variations, but what I'm trying to kind of get to is that you still need to review your report for any type of errors. So recording or dictating reports shifts the bulk of writing time to different divisions in the organization, perhaps even the records division. And even with recording or dictating, the officers, again, you still have to take the time to look at what's in your report. Don't assume that what you think you spoke into that dictation machine is going to end up on the paper. Because sometimes things aren't exactly, there's a spelling error or the word doesn't transpose over properly, etc. So that's the transcription type reporting. When you talk about computerized report writing, there's hardware that's needed for word processing. It's become a lot smaller and a lot faster. It's a lot easier to use and most portable. And a lot of departments are using portable laptops where you can pull them off the console of your patrol unit and even take it into a house and type in there. Some organizations even use iPads. There's software out there that's continuing to get better. They call it paperless reporting programs. It's not as paperless as everybody thinks it is, but that's kind of how it goes. And there's spell check and different things that are built in. So we just need to understand that, computerized report writing is a big thing right now, and typically this is what a lot of organizations do. It does allow you to type in the car, as I talked about before. And your vehicle in this techie days may kind of look like this, where you may have the ability to type your reports, smaller reports, in the car. And you can even transmit those reports from your vehicle to the station. It's actually kind of cool. So, and that way you don't even have to come to the station. But sometimes you may want to go to the station and they'll have a separate report writing area. But just consider that while technology continues to get really better, it's data in, data out. So it's whatever you put in there. So you can't correct sloppy data entry. So you still have to pay attention to what you're doing and what goes into these report writing systems. All right, so how do you evaluate your report? So you're kind of all done. So once you've written your report, now what? Well, once you've written your report, you do need to evaluate it. Don't just simply add the final period, staple the pages together, and turn it in. Or if you're doing it on a computer internally, a lot of times you will electronically submit it. You don't have to print it out. So what you want to do is you want to proofread it to look for mistakes in spelling, punctuation, and even capitalization. Also make certain that it says what you want it to say and it contains no content or composition errors. Ask yourself if the report covers what we've talked about. Is it factual? Is it accurate? Is it objective? Is it complete? Is it concise? Is it clear? Is it grammatically and mechanically correct? Is it written in a format that is in paragraphs? Is it organized properly? Is it written in past tense? Does it use the first person and the active voice? Is it audience focused? And is it legible? And it probably is if it's computer driven. And for larger reports, you may even want to have a fellow officer whose writing that you think is good maybe proofread your report. That's not a bad idea. A lot of times when I was a new officer, I would hand it to another person. Now, when you're brand new, you'll hand it to your field training officer. But even when I got off training, if it was a critical report, I would have somebody look at it and give me some ideas to make sure that I was on track. So hopefully that kind of makes sense when you're talking about proofreading and everything else. So, you know, in your textbook on page, I think it's on page 92, there's an evaluation checklist, and that may be a good idea for you to look at to kind of keep you on track, to evaluate, and you can kind of check down to make sure that you've gone through every single one of those points that we've talked about. And then once you've completed all of those points, then you're good to go ahead and turn your report in. So what are some other options that are out there? Well, just really quick, I wanted to talk about online reporting, because sometimes, and in order to increase or to make departments more efficient and even more effective, they allow individuals to do their report online, and the citizen does the reports. So online reporting by citizens, is very beneficial, and some of the benefits would be increased caseload processing efficiency, increased patrol officer effectiveness. Online reporting would allow private security to file shoplifting reports online. There's a reduction in writing reports for sworn officers for minor incidents. And these reports can be directly downloaded into the department's records. And in addition to that, the person writing the report can get a copy of it immediately. So it's actually kind of a cool thing. And a lot of departments, they'll use these online reports for simple things like lost property, or very simple theft reports, or vandalism or graffiti, maybe even harassing phone calls. And it ranges from department to department, but you can do these reports again online, and then you submit the report. They'll give you a case number, and you can get a copy of it right away. And then you can take that report and you can turn it into your insurance company. So there are quite a few benefits. So that it's actually kind of a neat thing to talk about. So the final report, and this kind of wraps things up for our lecture. The culmination of everything that we have done, once it's all done and things are final, that final report again is going to go to court. And consider those pieces. The prosecution's report, that's where all the essential information is gathered, and then this case goes to trial. Now, on the right on your screen here, I have a really cool thing. So if you remember the huge case law, the case precedent in Terry versus Ohio, this is actually the report that was written on that particular case. So it's interesting to see how reports have evolved over the years. But a final couple notes on the importance of well-written reports. So given the many uses of reports and the number of people that are going to rely on them, the importance of reports really should be clear now. What is key here is to make these necessary documents as well written as possible maximizing the benefits that they can provide. So, well-written reports further the cause of justice, but they also reflect positively on you, your competence and your credibility and your professionalism. In fact, your reputation and that of your department often rests on the written word, on your reports. And think about that. It can enhance your career. If you're a good report writer, if you've developed that skill, you might have a chance to promote in the organization to detective and do these huge, these more complex investigations because you write so well. And when your reports go over to the DA's office, the district attorney's office, you have to think about that. That the district attorneys, they know which officers write good reports because they file those cases all the time. And the ones that don't get filed are sometimes those officers that take the shortcuts, that don't write those really complete and effective reports. And one last consideration, really important consideration as it relates to reports. Officers who report false information or selectively include information or facts favorable to the defendant can find themselves caught up in what's known as a Brady or Gigolo situation, where their testimony is considered unreliable or impeachable by the court. And again, this happens when officers might exclude information, selectively exclude things or facts that might be favorable to the defendant. But remember, your job in a report is to document the facts, all of the facts. We've covered that. So you can't just pick and choose what you want to put in your report. And the two cases that structure this credibility issue are Brady versus Maryland, which does require any adverse disciplinary information about a officer's integrity or honesty to be turned over to the defense, and the Gigolo case, which is Gigolo versus United States, which extended the reach of impeachment evidence, particularly law enforcement testimony at trial. So you could, if you continually leave information out or selectively do this, and it's brought to the attention of the attorneys, you could actually be kind of marked, if you will, as a Brady case or a Brady Gigolo case or officer, and therefore a lot of times you could be subject to impeachment. And that information that you are labeled, if you will, as one of those type of officers can be brought before a jury. So you have to be very, very careful and make sure that you are being very factual in your reports. Okay, so let's sum it all up here. So reports are permanent written records of important facts of a case, all of the facts. The effective report writer attends to both content and form. Remember, it covers content of an effective report, meaning the factual, accurate, objective, and completeness of a report. So hopefully, and form, which is the being concise and clear, grammatically and mechanically correct. All right. An effective report is also factual. And a well-written report helps the criminal justice system in its entirety operate more efficiently and operate more effectively. So with that being said, I want to leave you with just one other quote from an author by the name of Swabozinski, and that's a tough last name to say. But here's what the author says. Your investigative report may be the one pivotal piece of documentation that makes a difference in the prosecution of a murderer or a serial rapist. You certainly don't want it to be the weakest link in the investigation and provide a gap for an offender to get away with their crime. And that sums it up. So with that said, that will conclude part 2 of our chapter 3 lecture on writing effective reports.